I want you to picture something. You are standing in the rain outside a cabin you built with your own hands. The lights are on inside. The window is fogged from heat. And through that fog, you see two silhouettes, moving, tangled together. And one of them belongs to the man who swore on the night of the full moon under the ancient marking tree of your pack that you were his only one, his forever. I heard them laughing. That was the part that broke me. Not the touching, not the kissing, the laughing, like I was a joke he had already moved on from, like I was yesterday's weather. My name is Zara Ashvale. I was 22 years old. I was the weakest ranked female in the Iron Veil pack. And on the worst night of my life, I made a decision that changed everything. I let a stranger touch my neck. I let him mark me, and I didn't know, I could not have known, that the man I had just bound my soul to was the most powerful werewolf alive. This is my story. Before the tale unfolds, tell me, would you choose love or power? Drop it in the comments, now. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Fog on the Window. The rain came down hard that night, the kind of rain that bends the pine trees sideways and turns dirt roads into rivers. I remember the smell of it, cold iron and cedar, as I stood on the narrow path outside Calder's cabin, 30 minutes after he had told me he was too tired to see me. Too tired. I had walked 4 miles in the dark to bring him the meal he had asked for the day before. Sweet potato stew, the way his mother used to make it, with dried rosemary from my window box, and a piece of cornbread wrapped in cloth to keep it warm. I had a thermos. I had a lantern. I was standing in the rain like a fool with a thermos, and I was smiling because I loved him. That was the truth of me. I loved Calder Morn with every soft, breakable piece of my heart. He was the beta's son. Broad-shouldered, dark-haired, the kind of boy that girls in our pack whispered about when they thought no one was listening. And he had chosen me, plain, quiet Zara Ashvale, daughter of a dead Omega male and a woman who had left the pack before I could remember her face. I had always told myself that his choosing me meant something sacred. That night, the cabin window told me otherwise. I saw the fog first, the kind that happens when the inside of a room is much warmer than the outside world. The window was glowing amber, and through the condensation, I could make out movement. 2 shapes. One of them was tall. That was Calder. I knew his posture from 100 yards. The other shape was smaller, curved, and pressed against him like she had always belonged there. I stood very still. The rain soaked through my jacket, through my shirt, through my skin. But I did not feel cold. I felt something much worse than cold. I felt like the ground had quietly removed itself from beneath my feet, and I was just standing on air, waiting to fall. Then I heard her laugh, high and bright, the way a girl laughs when she feels completely safe, the way I used to laugh once, before I learned that safety was a thing you could lose without warning. I set the thermos down on the muddy path. I set the lantern down beside it. I turned around, and I walked. I didn't run. Running would have meant panic, and some strange, bruised dignity in me refused to panic. I walked 1 foot in front of the other, down the dirt road and past the oak marker at the pack's western border, out into the forest that separated Iron Veil territory from the rest of the world. I walked until the cabin light was gone. I walked until the pine trees closed around me like a fist. Then I sat down on a wet boulder and I let myself feel it. All of it. The humiliation of the thermos. The 4 miles. The rosemary. The way he had kissed me on Sunday and told me he had been thinking about our future. I let all of that land, 1 piece at a time, like stones being dropped into my chest. I didn't cry. I had grown up being told that omegas don't break down in the wild because the forest can smell weakness. My father had drilled that into me before he died. "Zara," he would say, "the woods don't care about your feelings. They only care about what you do next." So I sat, and I breathed, and I thought about what to do next. That was when I heard footsteps. They were heavy, measured, Not the sound of a pack member out for a run. Those steps were always loose, a little reckless. These steps had intention behind them. They moved through the wet brush, like the brush was not an obstacle, but simply a thing to pass through. I should have stood up. I should have shifted and run. Instead, I turned my head toward the sound. He came out of the dark between two enormous fir trees, and for a moment I could not make full sense of him. He was tall, taller than Calder, taller than anyone in Iron Vale, and his coat was dark and rain-soaked. His hair was black and pushed back from a face that was hard and angular and completely expressionless. He wasn't dressed like a pack wolf. No territory markings on his jacket. No scent I recognized. He stopped when he saw me. We looked at each other for a long moment, the rain hissing between us. "You're bleeding," he said. I looked down. I had walked through a thorn bush without noticing, and there was a long, thin cut along the back of my left hand. The rain had washed it clean, but it was still bleeding slowly. "I know," I said. "You're also sitting on the border of Iron Vale territory in the middle of a rainstorm," he said. "Alone." "I know that too." He didn't smile, but something shifted in his face, some small, almost invisible adjustment that I couldn't name. He tilted his head slightly, the way wolves do when they are listening to something beneath the obvious sounds. "You've been crying," he said. "I haven't," I told him. He looked at me for another long moment. Then, without asking, he sat down on the boulder 2 feet away from me. Not close enough to be threatening, just close enough to be present. We sat in the rain together for several minutes without speaking. I don't know why I didn't leave. Something about the way he sat, like he had all the time in the world, like the rain was completely irrelevant, made me feel less alone instead of more afraid. "What's your name?" I asked. He paused before answering, just long enough for me to notice. "Kyle," he said. "Zara?" I said. He nodded like he was filing that away somewhere important. "Who hurt you?" he asked, and I laughed, a short, hard, surprised sound that I hadn't planned to make. "Is it that obvious?" "You walked through a thorn bush and didn't notice," he said. "People only do that when their mind is somewhere too painful to leave." I looked at him then, really looked. His eyes were very dark, not brown, but a deep gray-green that caught the light strangely in the dark. There was something in them that I had never seen in Calder's eyes. Not warmth exactly. Something older than warmth. Something that looked like it had witnessed a great many things and was no longer surprised by any of them. "My mate," I said carefully, "was with someone else tonight." Cale said nothing. "I had brought him dinner," I added, because for some reason I wanted him to understand the fullness of it. The complete absurdity of the thermos in the rain. Something in his jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "What will you do?" he asked. I looked out at the dark trees. The rain was beginning to slow. I could feel the pack bonds humming faintly at the edge of my awareness. Iron Vale's territory, Iron Vale's rules, Iron Vale's hierarchy that had always put me somewhere near the bottom and seemed unlikely to change. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. And then I said something that I had not planned to say. Something that came out of that raw, scraped-open place in my chest where the love for Calder Morn used to live. "If you were going to mark someone tonight," I said slowly, not quite looking at him, "would you ask first? Or just do it?" The silence that followed that question was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Cale turned his head toward me, and for the first time since he had sat down, I saw something move behind those gray-green eyes. Something careful. Something that looked a great deal like recognition. "I would ask," he said quietly. I turned to face him fully. "Then I'm asking you to ask me," I said. He looked at me for a long, breathless moment, and then he spoke 3 words that cracked my world clean open. Chapter 2, The Girl the Pack Forgot. Let me take you back, not to that night in the rain, not to Cale's voice or the weight of what I had just asked a stranger to do. Let me take you further 4 years back, to the summer I turned 18, and stood in the Ironvale assembly yard under the big ash trees while the Pack Alpha announced mate bonds for that year's cohort. The yard was dusty, it was late July, and the grass had gone yellow, and the air tasted of dry pollen and the smoke from the fire pits. The young wolves stood in a loose circle, some nervous, some performing confidence. I stood near the back, as I always did. There were 23 of us in the cohort. 22 found their mates that day. I stood in the circle until the sun went sideways and orange and everyone else had drifted away in pairs, and then I stood alone in the yard, while the ash trees dropped seed pods around me in the quiet. Ironvale Pack was not an unkind place exactly. It was just a place that had very clear ideas about worth. Alpha wolves mattered most, then betas, then the regular pack members, then, at the very bottom, the omegas, the low-ranked wolves who were considered useful for labor and loyalty, but not particularly important for anything else. My father had been an omega, a good man, steady, careful, honest, but the kind of man the pack overlooked unless something needed carrying. He died when I was 14. A border skirmish with a rival pack, the kind of thing that wasn't supposed to happen anymore, but did anyway. He wasn't even a fighter. He had just been in the wrong place, carrying supplies to the wrong checkpoint at the wrong time. The pack mourned for 3 days, and then moved on. I moved on too, because that was what you did. I worked in the pack kitchen from the time I was 15. I was good at it, organized, fast, creative, with limited ingredients. By the time I was 17, I was running the morning shift alone, feeding 40 wolves before the sun was properly up. That was where Calder Morn first noticed me. He had come in one October morning smelling of wood smoke and training fields, and I had handed him a bowl of oat porridge with dried blackberries, and he had looked at me, really looked at me, like I was a person and not a kitchen fixture, and said, "You're Zara. I've been watching you work." I remember the exact quality of that morning light. Pale gold through the kitchen windows, dust floating in it like small stars. I've been watching you work. I know how that sounds now. I know it sounds like a man noticing a useful thing. But at 17, standing in a kitchen at 5 in the morning, being told by the beta's son that he had been watching me, felt like the sun coming out specifically for my benefit. We were together for 4 years. He never formally marked me. That was the thing I had pushed to the back of my mind, the thing I had dressed up in excuses and explanations, and the word patience. Marking was permanent. Marking was the full pack bond, the mate claim, the thing that said, this person belongs with me, and I with them, and there is nothing in this world or the next that will change that. Calder said he wanted to be sure. He said he wanted to wait until he was ready to take over his father's beta position, so that when he claimed me, he could claim me properly, with status and ceremony. I believed him. I kept believing him for 4 years, through 17 other girls who found their mates and moved into the marked mate cabins on the east side of pack grounds, through the looks the older pack women gave me when they thought I wasn't watching, through the way Calder's father, Beta Roan Morn, would look through me at pack gatherings as if I were furniture. I kept believing right up until that rainy night with the thermos. Now let me tell you about the morning after. I had slept in the forest. Not unusual for me. I sometimes shifted and ran at night when the pack ground felt too small. But this time I hadn't shifted. I had found a dry space under a wide spruce, curled into my coat, and slept the deep, numb sleep of someone whose body has decided that feelings can wait until morning. I woke to gray light and bird noise, and the memory of Kyle sitting beside me on the wet boulder. He had not marked me that night. After I had said what I said, "I'm asking you to ask me," he had looked at me for a very long time, and then he had said quietly and carefully, "Not tonight." I had felt something twist in my chest, rejection on top of rejection. But then he had added, "Not because you're not worth it, because you deserve to make that choice when you're not bleeding." He meant the cut on my hand, but we both understood he meant the other wound too. He had walked me to the edge of Ironvale territory. Not inside, he stopped at the border marker, a carved stone post that the pack had placed generations ago, and he had said, "Will you be here tomorrow night?" "I don't know," I told him honestly. "I'll be here," he said. and he walked back into the dark. I lay under that spruce tree in the early morning, and I thought about the way he had said, "Not because you're not worth it." I said it back to myself 3 or 4 times. The way you press on a bruise to understand its shape. Calder Morn had been with me for 4 years, and he had never once said anything close to that. He had told me I was pretty. He had told me I was good at cooking. He had told me I was loyal, the way you tell a dog it is loyal. But he had never looked at me the way Cale had looked at me in the dark, like my value was not a question he needed to think about. I should tell you about the pack dynamics that made all of this more complicated. Ironvale sat in a valley in the northern part of what humans called the Cascades, a cold, forested territory bounded by 2 rivers and a mountain ridge. We were a mid-sized pack. Roughly 300 wolves, maybe 120 who were shifted, capable fighters. Our alpha was Drevon Morn, Calder's uncle, not his father, a large, gray-templed man who ruled with the particular kind of cruelty that looks reasonable from the outside. He had made rules that kept Omegas in their place. No mate claims above rank. No Omega could refuse a work assignment. No Omega could leave pack territory without written permission from a Beta or above. Those rules were the bars of the cage I had been living inside. When I got up from under the spruce tree and walked back to my small cabin on the Omega Row, I felt them differently. Not as facts about the world. As choices that someone had made, which meant that different choices were also possible. I made myself breakfast. I went to the kitchen and worked the morning shift. I smiled when people spoke to me. I answered questions. I moved through the day like water moving through cracks, quiet, small, finding the path of least resistance. And beneath all of that surface, something was shifting. I was thinking about a boulder in the rain. I was thinking about a man who had sat beside me without being asked. I was thinking about going back. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the first cold came off the river, I walked to the western border. The carved stone post was right where it always was, and so was Kyle. Chapter 3. What the border keeps out. He was leaning against the stone post with his arms crossed when I found him, looking at the tree line like he was reading something written there. He had changed clothes since the night before. Dark trousers, a heavy gray shirt that looked like it was made for actual cold, the kind of cold that our mountain winters brought down without apology. He straightened when he saw me. "You came," he said. "You said you'd be here," I answered. Like that explained it. He looked at me for a moment. "Are you better than last night?" "I'm drier," I told him. "That counts." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, more like the memory of a smile. But it changed his face significantly, softened something in the set of his jaw, and I caught myself staring before I could stop it. We walked along the border together, inside the line because he did not step onto Ironvale territory, and I did not step off it. We simply walked parallel to the boundary marker, as if we had agreed to this arrangement without speaking about it. I asked him where he was from. He said, "Far from here?" I asked him what pack. He said, "Does it matter?" It should have. In the wolf world, pack identity is everything. It tells you rank, territory, alliance history, everything that determines how you treat a person and how you expect to be treated. A wolf from a minor pack is very different from a wolf from a major one, and a rogue, a wolf without a pack, was someone most Ironvale members would report to Alpha Drevon without a second thought. But standing there in the evening light with this man who had sat beside me in the rain and told me I deserved better, I found that I did not especially care which box he fit into. "Tell me about yourself," he said. It was such a simple request. I had been asked that question before and found it difficult. What was there to say about Zara Ashvale? Kitchen worker, Omega daughter, woman who had waited 4 years for a man who was never going to choose her. But something about the way Cale asked it, without expectation in his voice, made me answer differently. I told him about my father. I told him about the morning shifts, the smell of the kitchen at 5 a.m., yeast and wood smoke, and something faintly mineral from the well water, the way the light came in sideways, the particular satisfaction of feeding a lot of people efficiently, of looking at a row of full bowls and knowing you had made that happen. I told him about the mate circle at 18, the ash seeds falling in the empty yard. He listened the way very few people listen, without his attention drifting, without preparing his next sentence while I was still in the middle of mine. His eyes stayed on me. Not in a hungry way, not in the way Calder sometimes looked at me when he wanted something. Just present. Completely present, like I was the most interesting thing in his landscape. "You've been invisible on purpose," he said when I ran out of things to say. I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you learned young that being visible in your pack led to complications," he said. "So you made yourself useful instead of noticeable. You fed people. You worked early. You kept yourself one rank too low to threaten anyone." He paused. "It kept you safe, but it also kept you from being seen." I stared at him. "You got all that from a 20-minute walk?" "I got all that from watching you move," he said simply. There it was again, that word. Watch. But so different from how Calder had used it. Calder had watched me like a man noticing a useful resource. Cale watched me like someone paying close attention to something he found genuinely worth understanding. "What about you?" I said, because I needed to redirect this before something cracked in my composure. "Who are you, Kyle from far away?" "Someone who travels," he said. "Where?" "Everywhere there's trouble that needs resolving." "That sounds like a job description." "It is," he said without explaining further. We walked in silence for a few minutes. The sky had gone fully dark now, and the first stars were appearing over the ridge. A wolf howled somewhere deep in Iron Vale territory. One of the patrol runners calling position. I tracked the sound automatically, the way you do when you've grown up inside pack bonds, and I saw Cale's head turn toward it too. He tracked it with the same automatic precision, and I noted, not for the first time, that he moved and paid attention the way high-ranked wolves moved and paid attention. "You're ranked," I said suddenly. He looked at me. "Hi," I pressed. "You're not a rogue. The way you stand, the way you listen to the forest, you're high-ranked." Something crossed his face, there and gone so fast I almost missed it. Not quite guilt. Something more complicated. "Perceptive," he said. "Tell me what rank," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. The starlight caught the gray-green of his eyes, and I had the strange sensation that if I looked at them long enough, I would understand something enormous. "Does it change anything?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "Probably," I admitted. "But I'd rather know and deal with it than not know and be foolish." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'm not ready to tell you that. Not yet." He held my gaze steadily. "I know that's not the answer you wanted. I'm asking you to trust me with a few more nights." A few more nights. I should have pushed harder. I know that now. But there was something in the way he said it. Not evasive, not manipulative, but careful. Like the truth of who he was a large and consequential thing, and he wanted to deliver it at the right moment, not blurt it out beside a border marker in the dark. "Fine," I said. "A few more nights." We talked until the moon was high. He asked about pack governance, not in a casual way, in the specific way of someone gathering useful information. I told him about Alpha Drevon, the way he ruled, the Omega restrictions. I found myself being more honest than I intended to be, because the dark made it easier, and because Cale received everything I said without flinching, without performing surprise or sympathy, just processing it with that still, watchful attention of his. "Those restrictions are illegal under Continental Pack Law," he said when I finished describing the no-exit rule for Omegas. I blinked. "What?" "No Alpha has the right to restrict a pack member's movement except in cases of active territorial emergency," he said, with the flat certainty of someone who had not just heard this fact, but had authored it, or enforced it, or both. "What your Alpha is doing is a violation of the Accord." I stared at him. "The Accord?" "The Continental Pack Accord," he said. "The governing framework that all recognized packs operate under." He paused, and I saw him make a small internal decision, the kind you can see in a person's shoulders, The accord is enforced by the Alpha King's court. The Alpha King. Every wolf on the continent knew the title. The King's court existed above all individual packs, a governing body with the authority to intervene in pack affairs, punish violating alphas, even dissolve packs. It was not a power invoked often. When it was invoked, things changed drastically and permanently. You know a lot about the accord, I said carefully. I study governance, he said easily. Too easily, the answer was prepared. I noted it. I filed it away. I did not push. But walking home along the dark road to Omega Row, something was vibrating at the edge of my understanding. A feeling like when you are reading a story and you have just noticed that you know how it ends, even though you're only on the 3rd chapter. Tomorrow night, I told myself. Tomorrow night I would push harder. I never got the chance. Because the next morning, Calder Morn showed up at my kitchen door with flowers, a practiced look of remorse, and a lie so beautiful, I almost believed it. Chapter 4, Beautiful Lies. The flowers were wild flowers, not bought ones, but picked, which made it worse somehow. He had gone into the meadow past the western training grounds, and he had picked blue chicory and late-season yarrow and bound them with a piece of brown twine. He was standing in the kitchen doorway at 6:15 in the morning, with flower dust still in the air around me, and he looked devastated. Honestly, genuinely devastated. The way beautiful people look when they know they need something from you. Zara, he said. Just my name. Low, soft, the way he used to say it when we were new. I set down the pan I was holding very slowly and deliberately. Calder, I said, I need to talk to you. His eyes moved to the 2 kitchen helpers working the back station, and I read his meaning. Alone. I nodded to the helpers, who took the hint and found reasons to be elsewhere, and then I was standing alone in my kitchen with the man who had been laughing in a warm cabin while I stood in the rain with a thermos, and I waited to hear what he had decided to tell me. It wasn't what it looked like, he started. I kept my face neutral. What did it look like? He had the grace to hesitate. Zara, I know you were there. I found your thermos on the path this morning. The thermos. Right. I had left it in the mud. Okay, I said. It was Silene, he said, like the name explained something. Silene Voss was the daughter of the pack healer. High-ranked, light-haired, the kind of girl who had always belonged in the central cabin circle and knew it. She was upset. Her sister got mated last week and she was having a hard time. She came over and I let her in because I didn't know what else to do, and things got complicated, I offered. Out of hand, he said. He looked at the floor. It was a practiced gesture. I had not noticed until now how practiced his remorse was, how it hit all the expected notes without missing one. I should have called you. I should have told her to go. I made a terrible mistake, Zara. She doesn't mean anything. She doesn't mean anything. I thought about how it would feel to be Silene Voss, and know that the man you had been pressed against the night before had described you, to his other woman, as nothing. I thought about how it felt to be me. I want to mark you, Calder said. I went very still. He looked up then, and his eyes were dark and urgent. I've been waiting too long. I've been foolish. I almost lost you, and I can see that now, and I'm telling you, I want to mark you. Formally. At the next full moon ceremony. In front of the whole pack. The next full moon ceremony was 6 weeks away. It was the pack's largest ritual occasion, mates claimed and marked publicly, before Alpha Dreven and all 300 Ironvale wolves, with a feast that lasted until dawn. It was exactly the kind of claiming Calder had always told me he was building toward. Proper. Ceremonial. With status. I looked at the wildflowers in his hand. I looked at his face. And I tried very hard to find the thing I had always found there. The warmth, the aliveness that had made me stand in the yellow grass of the cohort circle and still feel lucky even when everyone else had found their person, and I had not. I tried to find the man who had come into the kitchen at 17 and noticed me, What I found instead was Kale's voice. Not because you're not worth it. Because you deserve to make that choice when you're not bleeding. Give me a day, I said to Calder. His brow creased. He had been expecting yes. The flowers had been confidence, not hope. What does that mean? It means I need a day, I said. To think. I watched something move across his face. Not devastation this time. Something closer to irritation. Quickly swallowed. Zara, I just told you I want to mark you. And I said I need a day, I said steadily. If you mean it, one day won't change that. He left with the flowers. He did not leave them with me, which told me something I stored away for later. I worked through the morning shift with my hands in dough and my mind somewhere on the western border under a sky full of stars. I thought about 4 years. I thought about every time I'd made myself smaller and quieter and more useful to avoid being a problem. I thought about Alpha Dreven's rules about Omega movement and about the word illegal in Kale's steady, informed voice. I thought about the full moon ceremony, standing in front of the pack, being marked by Calder Morn before 300 witnesses, and I thought about how, the morning after, I would still be Zara Ashvale of Omega Rho, and Calder would still be the Beta's son, and nothing about the cage would have changed except that now I would be locked inside it with company. At noon, I took my break and walked to the western border. Kyle was not there, of course. We had said nights, not middays. But I stood at the carved stone marker, and I looked out into the open forest beyond Ironvale territory, and I tried to imagine stepping over it. Truly stepping over, with my whole life gathered up behind me, and the unknown in front. I could not quite picture it. That was the truth of what Ironvale had done to me. It had been a cage for so long that I could no longer fully imagine being outside it. The bars were invisible, but they were real, and they were made of small daily confirmations that I was not the kind of person who got to walk away. When I got back to the kitchen, the pack healer's daughter, Silene Voss, was sitting at the kitchen table eating a bowl of my oat porridge like she owned the room. She looked up when I walked in. She had sharp, pretty features and eyes the color of winter ice, and she looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had seen it on other high-ranked women my whole life. Not malice, exactly. Something more casual than malice. The look of someone who has never had to think of you as competition and sees no reason to start now. Your porridge is good, she said. Thank you. I said because I had learned early that Omega Rho women who responded to provocation with anything other than calm were dismissed as unstable. She set the bowl down, studied me. He's going to get tired of playing at this, she said conversationally, like she was discussing weather. Calder. He does this. He feels guilty. He makes promises. He means them for a while. And then he gets tired. She shrugged. You should probably know that. From someone who isn't trying to hurt you. I looked at her for a long moment. How many times has he made those promises? I asked. She met my eyes. There was something honest in her expression that I had not expected. More than once, she said. She stood up, rinsed her bowl in the sink. Even that felt like a message, like she was so comfortable in my kitchen that she cleaned up after herself as a matter of course. She left. I stood in the middle of my kitchen, and I did not feel devastated. I felt something much more useful than devastation. I felt clear. That night, I went to the western border. Kyle was there, as promised. I sat down on the boulder, dry tonight, just cool and moss-covered, and I told him everything. Calder's offer, Silene's visit, the image of the formal claiming ceremony, and what it would mean, and what it would cost me. When I was done, Kale said nothing for a long moment. Then, what do you want? Not what should you do. Not here's what I think. Just, what do you want? I looked at the sky. I want to stop being afraid, I said. Of what? Of being alone, I said. Of being nothing. Kale turned to face me fully. The moonlight was behind him and his face was in shadow, but his eyes caught light the way dark water does. You are not nothing, he said. It came out like a decree, like a fact he was correcting because he had seen it stated wrongly and could not let it stand. Something broke open in my chest, quietly. "Then ask me," I said. And this time, he did. Chapter 5. The Marking. He said, "Zara Ashvale." "May I mark you?" 7 words. Spoken quietly, in the same tone a person uses to ask something they already know the weight of. Not rushed, not performative. The way you speak when the thing you are saying is real and you know it. And I said, "Yes." He moved slowly. He gave me every moment I needed to change my mind. His left hand came up to the side of my face, just his palm, cupped against my jaw, his thumb at my cheekbone. And he turned my head gently to the right, exposing the left side of my neck. His touch was warm, careful, precise, the way all of his movements were. I was shaking. Not from fear, from something I did not have a clean name for. The convergence of grief and courage, and the peculiar aliveness of doing an irreversible thing. His mouth touched the junction of my neck and shoulder. The marking is not a bite, exactly, not the way films and stories depict it. It is a specific pressure, a specific point of contact, where a wolf releases the chemical biological marker that bonds 2 wolves at the deepest neurological level. The sensation is hard to describe to someone who has never experienced it. I have heard it described as fire, as electricity, as a door flying open. For me, in that moment, it felt like a sound being turned on that I hadn't known was missing. Like a frequency I had been deaf to my whole life, suddenly humming to life in my bones. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. When Kyle drew back, we were both very still. I became aware of things in rapid succession. The night air, the sound of the river somewhere in the dark, the new and extraordinary sensation of a bond, not like the pack bond, which was wide and diffuse and felt like weather, but targeted and specific and devastatingly clear, like a single bright thread running from somewhere inside my chest to somewhere inside his. He was still close, his hand still on my jaw. He was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on him before, not the careful stillness he usually wore. Something exposed, something that looked, for just a moment, like surprise. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Are you?" He made a small sound that was almost a laugh. "I'll tell you in a moment." We separated. He leaned back. I put my hands in my lap and examined them, because I needed somewhere to look that was not his face, while I understood what I had just done. I had let a stranger mark me. I had let a stranger, a high-ranked wolf from an unknown pack whose last name I did not know, create the most permanent bond that existed in our world. More permanent than pack membership, more permanent than territory. A mate mark could not be undone by any means short of the death of one of the parties, and even then the surviving wolf carried the scar of it for life. I should have been terrified. Mostly I felt something that I can only describe as rightness. The terrible, inconvenient, impossible rightness of something that shouldn't make sense, but did. "Kyle," I said. "Yes." "I need you to tell me who you are." The pause this time was longer than any previous pause. Long enough for the frog chorus near the river to start up. Long enough for a night bird to call once from the tree line and fall silent. "I will," he said. "Tomorrow night." "Why not now?" He looked at me steadily. "Because I need tonight to have been only what it was," he said quietly. "When I tell you, everything will shift. I wanted one night of it being simple." There was something in his voice that I had not heard before. Something careful and almost tender. The way you speak about a thing you are afraid of changing. I didn't push. I walked back to Omega Row under a sky full of stars, with a new hum in my bones, and Calder Morn's wildflowers already wilting in a jar on my windowsill. I lay in my bed, and I waited. The new bond felt like a second heartbeat, faint and distant but absolutely steady. Like a pulse somewhere in the middle distance, constant and specific. I pressed my fingers to the mark on my neck, not painful, just sensitive, the skin warmer there than anywhere else. I thought about what Silene had said. More than once. I thought about 4 years of making myself useful and quiet and undemanding. I thought about the full moon ceremony 6 weeks away and the face Calder had made when I said, "Give me a day." That flicker of irritation beneath the performance of devotion. I thought about Kyle's voice saying, "You are not nothing," with the certainty of someone correcting a mathematical error. I fell asleep before midnight for the first time in weeks. The next morning, everything fell apart. It started in the kitchen. It started with Roan Morn, Calder's father, the beta, walking into my kitchen at 7 a.m. with 2 pack enforcers behind him, and the particular expression of a man executing a task he finds personally satisfying, but would describe as reluctant duty. He looked at my neck. He looked at the mark. I watched the color change in his face. "Well," he said, "that's unfortunate." I kept my hands steady on the counter. "Beta Morn. Turn around," he said, to the enforcers rather than to me, like I wasn't worth addressing directly. "We're done here. Tell the Alpha." I said, "Wait, Zara Ashvale," Roan said, turning back to me with the flat calm of someone who has never once doubted his right to speak over others. "You are hereby suspended from kitchen duties pending review. You have been marked by an unknown wolf without pack sanction. Under Iron Veil law, any Omega who accepts a mark from an external wolf without Alpha permission has committed a violation of pack code and is subject to immediate review and potential expulsion." The word expulsion landed in the room with the weight of a stone. Expulsion meant leaving Iron Veil. But it also meant leaving without rights, without the pack bond protections, without territory access, without any of the support structures that kept a lone wolf alive in the modern world. Expulsion was the pack's way of ensuring that leaving felt like death. I stood very straight. "I would like to speak to Alpha Dreven," I said. Roan looked at me with the mild contempt of someone asked to explain a fact of nature to an inanimate object. "The Alpha will speak to you when he's ready," he said. "In the meantime, you are confined to Omega Row." He left. The kitchen helpers were staring. I turned back to the stove and I finished the morning service, because I needed something to do with my hands, and because feeding people was the thing I knew how to do when everything else went sideways. And as I stirred and ladled and moved through the familiar choreography of the kitchen, I thought about the bond humming in my chest, distant but steady. A second heartbeat. A thread running toward a man who had asked me my name in the rain and told me I was worth the weight of the choice. Whoever he was. Whatever was coming. He had told me everything will shift when he told me the truth. I gripped the ladle. I was ready for it to shift. That evening, I did not go to the border alone. Calder Morn found me first, and he was not carrying flowers this time. Chapter 6. The Cost of Truth. He was standing in the path between Omega Row and the western border, arms crossed, jaw set, with the look on his face of a man who has been genuinely surprised and resents it deeply. Behind him, in the fading light, I could see 2 members of the pack enforcer unit at a distance, not close enough to intervene, close enough to watch. "Tell me it's not true," Calder said. I stopped walking. The evening air was cold and still. The first pine bats were already out, stitching back and forth above the tree line. "I can't tell you that," I said. His jaw tightened. "You let someone mark you." "Yes." "In 2 days," he said. "After I came to you. After I asked you to let me mark you. You went and let some stranger." He stopped, shook his head, as if the sentence was too absurd to finish. I looked at him steadily. "You didn't come to me, Calder. You came to the thermos I left in the mud." A muscle moved near his eye. "Zara, you came with flowers and a prepared speech because you were afraid I was going to cause a problem," I said. My voice was very calm. The calmness surprised me. I had expected to feel something more violent, but I felt instead the clarity I had found in the kitchen after Silene left. Clean and cold and exact. "You don't want to mark me because you love me. You want to mark me because an unmarked Omega who walks away from the Beta's sun is an embarrassment to the Morn name." He said nothing, which was an answer. I'm not angry at you, I said and meant it. I'm not even especially hurt anymore. But I need you to be honest with me about one thing before we stop standing here. He waited. How many other women have there been? The silence lasted long enough to be the answer. Then, it doesn't matter. How many? He looked away from me, out toward the tree line, the way people look when they are deciding how much truth is enough truth. A few, he said finally. Over the years. Nothing serious. A few. Over the years. I thought about the ceremony yard, the ash seeds falling, 17 other women finding their people while I stood at the back, lucky to be chosen. I thought about 4 years of patience and meals and early mornings and making myself useful and small. Okay, I said. Okay? He looked back at me, confused. Okay, I repeated. Thank you for telling me. I walked around him. Zara. He caught my arm, not roughly, but firmly. Whoever marked you, they're in danger. Alpha Drevon is furious. He's dispatched trackers to find the wolf. When they find him, what? I stopped walking. External wolves who mark pack members without sanction are subject to pack law, Calder said. His voice was flat now, the performance of remorse entirely gone. Depending on the Alpha's judgment, that can mean detention, or worse. I turned to face him fully. The trackers were already out. I thought of Kale at the border marker, easy and unhurried, with no apparent awareness that the pack he had been sitting beside for 3 nights might decide his presence was a threat. When did he send the trackers? I asked. This afternoon, Calder said. He paused. I'm telling you this because... He stopped again. Because you feel guilty, I said. He didn't deny it. I pulled my arm free, and I ran. Not toward the border, toward it but angling deeper into the tree line, where the undergrowth was thick enough to break my trail. I had grown up in this forest. I knew which paths the pack enforcers used, and which ones they didn't bother with because the undergrowth was too dense for comfortable running. I used those paths now, crashing through brush that tore at my jacket, keeping low under the heavy pine branches. I hit the western border in 11 minutes. Kyle was already there. He was standing, not sitting, alert, head up, facing outward into the open forest beyond the marker. When I broke through the tree line, he turned immediately, and I saw his face run through a rapid sequence: recognition, assessment, decision. Trackers, I said, breathing hard. Drevon sent trackers this afternoon. For you. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. How close? He asked. I don't know. I came as fast as I could. I was bent over, hands on my knees. Kyle, I need to tell you. You need to go. Cross back into open territory. They can't follow you past the border marker without... I'm not leaving, he said. I straightened up. What? I'm not leaving, he repeated simply, the way he said everything. Like it had been true already, and the conversation was just catching up with it. We're bonded. I don't leave a bonded mate in a dangerous pack with no protection. The word mate in his voice did something to my chest that I was not in a position to examine. They'll detain you, I said. Or worse, Calder said. Calder told you that to frighten you, Kale said, with the particular flatness of someone categorizing a strategy they find very unsophisticated. The threat works against a regular external wolf. It won't work on me. I stared at him. Why not? He looked at me. Those gray-green eyes in the dark forest, with the first sounds of pack trackers moving through the eastern tree line just barely audible in the distance. Zara, he said. I need to tell you now. Tell me what? He was quiet for one more moment. Then, my full name is Kale Draveth, he said. I am the Alpha King. The forest did not change. The trees stayed exactly where they were. The bat calls continued. The distant sound of trackers continued. The bond in my chest continued to pulse, steady and unaltered. I did not move. The Alpha King, I repeated. Yes. I thought about the Accord. His precise, authorial knowledge of pack law. The accord is enforced by the Alpha King's court. The way he had delivered that sentence like a man describing his own office. I thought about, does it matter what pack? I thought about, I'm not ready to tell you that. Not yet. I thought about 3 nights at a border marker with the most powerful wolf alive, who had sat beside me on a wet boulder and told me I deserved to make choices when I wasn't bleeding. You let me mark you, I said slowly. You asked, he said, and I wanted you to. I'm an Omega, I said, from a minor pack, in the middle of a mate dispute. I know what you are, he said. Something in his voice made the sentence sound like the opposite of diminishment. I've known from the first night. From somewhere behind me, in the Iron Veil tree line, I heard a tracker's whistle. Close. Much closer than I had expected. Kale's head turned toward the sound with absolute calm. They're going to come through that tree line in approximately 2 minutes, he said conversationally. And when they find me here, things are going to change very quickly for your pack. I want you to know that before they do. He looked at me. Are you ready? I was standing in a dark forest between a life that had never quite fit and something I could not yet see the shape of, and I was shaking slightly, and the bond in my chest was humming like a held note, and the trackers were coming. No, I told him honestly. He looked at me, and this time the near smile was real, and it transformed his face entirely, and for one bright, terrifying second I saw the fullness of who he was. Not the controlled observer on the boulder, but someone younger and more alive, and more surprised by his own feelings than he had expected to be. Neither am I, he said. The trackers broke through the tree line. And when they saw Kale's face, when one of them recognized him, every one of them stopped moving. Chapter 7, The Reckoning 3 Trackers. All male, all mid-rank fighters in Iron Veil's Enforcer unit. Garen Pools, who had been an enforcer since before I was born. 2 younger wolves I knew by sight, but not well. They came out of the tree line fast and low, the way trained trackers move, and stopped dead when they saw Kale. The youngest tracker made a sound I had never heard from an adult wolf before. A short, involuntary noise that was almost a whimper, and then immediately corrected it and pressed his lips together. His face had gone the color of old chalk. Garen Pools stopped. He was a hard, experienced man who had been in more confrontations than most Iron Veil wolves put together. He stood completely still, and the look on his face was not fear exactly, but a very rapid and visible recalibration of reality. The third tracker was already stepping back. Beta Pools, Kyle said. His voice was different. Not louder, Kale never seemed to need volume to fill a space. But the quality of it had changed. The careful, measured tone from the last 3 nights was still there, but now it sat on top of something else. An authority so fundamental it was almost gravitational. Stand down without those words being spoken. Garen Pools lowered his head. Not fully. Not the deep bow of formal submission, but the instinctive tilt of a ranked wolf acknowledging something above his rank. A visible, physical thing. My king, he said very carefully. My king. I heard my own breath. I had known logically for 4 minutes, since Kale had said the words, but hearing it from Garen Pools, hearing it in the voice of a man who had served Iron Veil Pack for 30 years and had never once lowered his head to anyone I had known personally, made it a different kind of known. Kale looked at the 3 trackers without expression. You'll stand down and return to your alpha, he said. Tell him the king is at his western border and will be entering Iron Veil territory tomorrow morning. He is to summon the full pack to the assembly yard at noon. A summons from the king was law. There was no question of whether Alpha Dreven would comply. Garen Pools looked just briefly at me. Something complicated moved across his face. Garen and I had known each other since I was 8 years old. He had eaten my porridge every morning for 14 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had lived inside Iron Veil's hierarchy and enforced its rules because those were the rules, and he had not thought to question them. The look on his face now was something close to bewilderment. Then he straightened, signaled to the other two with a hand gesture, and they withdrew into the tree line. In the silence they left behind, I stood very still, and Kale stood very still beside me, and the night made its ordinary sounds around us as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "You're the Alpha King," I said for the second time, because it seemed like something that needed to be said more than once before it would fit. "Yes," he said, "and tomorrow morning you're going into my pack. Yes, and whatever happens at noon in the assembly yard will depend somewhat on your alpha," he said, "and somewhat on you." I looked at him. "On me?" "You're my marked mate," he said. The word mine landed without possessiveness, as fact. How this is handled, what is claimed publicly, what is offered or demanded, you have voice in all of that. I won't make decisions about your life without you. I sat down on the boulder, not from weakness, but because there was simply too much to stand up in. Kyle sat beside me, as he had on the first night. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I'm thinking that 3 nights ago I was a kitchen worker with a broken heart and a thermos full of stew," I said. The real smile came again, fuller this time. It arrived slowly across his face like a sunrise, unhurried, inevitable, transforming. "And now?" he said. "And now I'm bonded to the Alpha King, and tomorrow my entire pack is going to find out," I said. "So I'm thinking I probably need to understand what that means before noon." He nodded, seriously. "Ask me what you need to know." I asked him everything. I asked about the continental governance structure, about the king's powers, about what happened when the king marked a mate who was already registered as the contested partner of a pack member. I asked about the Omega protection statutes under the Accord, which he answered with such fluency that I was certain he had written them. I asked what Drevin could and could not challenge legally. I asked about the process for pack reform. He answered everything. Not simplified, not glossed, direct and detailed, the way he had discussed the Accord from the beginning, because he had apparently already decided I was someone who could handle information given straight. "Why were you at the border?" I asked finally. "Why Ironvale? Why that night?" He was quiet for a moment. "Ironvale has been under review for 2 years," he said. "Drevin's Omega restrictions, the confinement rules, the rank suppression. There have been formal complaints filed with my court. I came to assess." He paused. "I was walking the border to get a sense of the pack's feel. I found a woman sitting on a boulder in the rain with a cut on her hand. I absorbed this. And you sat down." "And I sat down," he agreed. "That's not standard King's Court assessment procedure," I said. "No," he agreed without any sign of embarrassment. I turned to look at him fully. The moonlight was better tonight, and I could see his face clearly, the precise angularity of it, the gray-green eyes that had always seemed to contain more information than they revealed, the way his attention, when directed at me, had a quality of completeness that I had initially mistaken for watchfulness, and now understood was something more personal. "Did you know?" I asked. "When you sat down, did you know I might be relevant to your case? Is that why?" "No," he said, immediately, no hesitation. "I sat down because you looked like someone who needed another person nearby. Nothing more than that." I believed him. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I had been believing him from the second night. The quality of his attention, the way it was given without expectation of return, without the transactional calculus that I was used to from every other high-ranked wolf I had ever encountered, was not the attention of someone building a case. It was the attention of someone who found me genuinely interesting. "What happens to me after tomorrow?" I asked. "In practical terms, bonded to the king. No longer in Ironvale, presumably. What does that look like?" He was quiet for a moment. "That depends on what you want," he said. "My court is based in the Ashfall territory, 400 miles north. The work is governance, reviewing packs, resolving disputes, maintaining the Accord. It is demanding and sometimes dangerous and rarely simple. He paused. But the kitchen is good. I laughed. It came out surprised and full, the kind of laugh I had not heard from my own throat in longer than I could easily remember. And he watched it happen with that calm, complete attention of his, like he was memorizing it. Zara, he said quietly, I won't promise you this is simple. It isn't. You'll be the king's mate, which comes with attention and expectation and politics that you haven't had to navigate before. He held my gaze steadily. But I will tell you that I've been watching Pax for 12 years. In 12 years, I have never sat down uninvited on anyone's boulder. He paused. I didn't sit down because you were relevant to a case. I sat down because something about you made me stop moving. The bond hummed between us, bright and constant. The night was cold and enormous, and full of what was about to happen. Okay, I said. Tomorrow. We sat there until nearly dawn, and when the first gray light came through the pine tops, I walked back to Omega Row for the last time. Chapter 8. The Assembly. Omega Row in the early morning had a specific quality, quiet and gray-blue, the cabins all dark, the cook fire smoke beginning to rise from the central kitchen, where the early shift would already be starting without me. I walked back through it and went into my cabin, and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I looked at my room. It was small, clean, organized in the particular way of someone who has always had limited space and learned to treat it with care. There were 3 books on the shelf above the bed, a field guide to medicinal plants, a pack history I had read twice, and a novel with a cracked spine that I'd bought at the human market 2 years ago with money I had saved. There were dried herb bundles hanging from the ceiling beam, my father's habit, which I had inherited without thinking about it. There was a drawing on the wall that a pack child named Essie had made for me when she was 5, a very sincere portrait of me and her standing in the kitchen, both of us enormous and yellow-haired and grinning wildly, neither of us looking remotely like our actual selves. I packed 1 bag, practical things, clothes, the 3 books, Essie's drawing folded carefully, my father's knife with the worn leather handle. Things that were mine in the way that nothing about my circumstances in Ironvale had ever fully been mine. I set the bag beside the door. Then I went to the kitchen and I made breakfast. The 2 morning helpers, Bryn and Solide, 2 young Omega women who had worked with me for 2 years, came in at 5 as usual and stopped when they saw me. You're here, Bryn said, surprised. I'm here, I confirmed. 1 more morning. Something shifted in Bryn's face. She was 20, young, perceptive, quick to understand the subtext of things, even when she didn't know the facts. She looked at the mark on my neck. She looked at my face. She nodded slowly and went to her station and began the morning work without another word. Solide asked quietly, while I was portioning the oat grain, Is it true? What they're saying? About the wolf at the border? Probably, I said. Is he dangerous? She asked. I thought about a man sitting beside me in the rain without being asked. Not to us, I said. We worked through the service, fed 40 wolves. At 7 a.m., I removed my kitchen apron, folded it, and laid it on the counter. I looked at the kitchen, at the copper pots and the herb wall and the deep-scarred wooden cutting boards and the window where the morning light came in sideways, and I felt something that was not quite sorrow and not quite relief, but a specific mixture of both that I had no word for. Take care of this place, I told Bryn. She looked up. Her eyes were bright. We will, she said. And then, you deserved better than this pack gave you, Zara. I didn't trust my voice entirely. I touched her shoulder briefly, and I walked out. Kyle entered through the western border at 9 a.m. I know because I felt it in the bond. A specific change in the quality of the hum, a shift from distant to close, like turning up the volume on something that had always been playing. I was standing near the assembly yard when it happened, and I pressed my hand flat against my sternum for a moment and breathed. He had brought 3 people with him. Court attendants, I understood later, who had been camped in the forest during the 3 days of his border assessment. They wore the mark of the King's Court on their jackets. A deep gray compass rose on black, something I had seen in books but never in person. The pack was already gathering. Alpha Dreven Morn had received the tracker's message the night before. He had called the full assembly at noon as instructed, because he had no legal option not to. But the atmosphere in the yard when I arrived was the particular atmosphere of a pack that had been told something impossible and has not yet decided how to arrange its face. Dreven was standing at the head of the yard beside Beta Roan, both of them in formal gray, the assembly color. Dreven was tall, gray-templed, with the careful posture of a man who had learned to seem inevitable. He had ruled Iron Vale for 19 years. He had built his authority on the assumption that no challenge would ever be significant enough to require his actual strength. He was looking at Kyle as if looking at a natural disaster, the specific expression of a man watching something that cannot be negotiated with approach. Calder Morn was somewhere in the crowd to my right. I did not look at him. Kyle walked to the center of the assembly yard with his 3 court attendants and stood there, and the 300 wolves of Ironvale arranged themselves around the circle in the old way, a leftover of ancestral pack ritual, and went quiet. "Alpha Drevon," Kyle said. His voice in the open air of the yard carried differently than it had in the forest. Not louder, more resonant, like sound from a larger space. "I am Kale Draveth, Alpha King. I am here in my capacity as a Court Enforcer," Drevon said carefully. "My king, you honor us." "I don't," Kale said pleasantly. "I'm here on a complaint review. 2 years of filed complaints against Iron Vale Pack regarding illegal restrictions on Omega-ranked members, rank-based labor conscription without compensation, and denial of free movement rights. The complaints are specific and documented." He held Drevon's gaze without blinking. "I have completed my assessment. The complaints are substantiated." The yard was absolutely silent. I could feel the pack around me absorbing this. Not just the words, the implications. The Alpha King had been in their territory for 3 days. He had assessed them. He had found them in violation. Driven said, "My king, these matters are pack internal." "They stopped being pack internal when they violated the accord," Kale said, with the same pleasant, immovable calm. "Ironvale will undergo reform under court supervision. The Omega movement restrictions are void as of this moment. The labor conscription protocols are suspended pending review." He paused. "Additionally," that word, additionally, it landed with weight. "During my assessment, I encountered a member of your pack at the western border, Zara Ashvale." He turned his head and found me in the crowd, and every eye in the assembly turned with his gaze, and I felt the weight of 300 stares land on me at once and stood in it without flinching, because something had happened in the kitchen that morning that had changed the quality of my spine. "She is my marked mate," he said. "She is now under the direct protection of the King's Court, and will leave Iron Vale under my escort." A sound ran through the crowd. Not one sound, dozens of small ones. Indrawn breaths, surprised exhalations, the rustle of people turning to look at neighbors. I found Bryn's face near the kitchen entrance. She was looking at me with her eyes wide and something that looked remarkably like fierce satisfaction. Calder Morn. I made myself find him. He was standing at the edge of the yard near his father, and his face had an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not guilt. Something smaller than either of those. Something that looked, from this distance, like a man understanding for the first time the full weight of something he had casually discarded. I looked at him for 3 seconds. Then I looked away. Drevon said tightly, "The girl violated pack code, accepting a mark from an external wolf without sanction." "There is no violation," Kale said simply. "The King's marking requires no pack sanction. You're aware of this." He looked at Drevon with the same mild, absolute expression. "I'd recommend consulting your accord documentation before making further legal arguments in this yard." Silence. Roan Morn's face had gone the color of ash. Calder looked at the ground. and Drevin Morn, who had ruled Iron Vale for 19 years, as if he would rule it forever, said nothing. In the silence that followed, I walked across the assembly yard, through the crowd, past the Morn family, past 14 years of kitchen mornings, and invisible rank, and other people's rules, and I stood beside my mate. Chapter 9. Everything at once. Standing beside Kyle in that yard, I learned something about authority that I had never understood from the inside of Iron Vale's hierarchy. Drevon's authority had always looked like pressure, like the lid on a pot held down by weight. His people obeyed because the consequences of disobedience were clear and immediate and painful. That is one kind of power. It is effective, but it requires constant maintenance, constant vigilance, because the moment the pressure eases even slightly, things boil over. Kale's authority looked different. He wasn't threatening Drevon. He wasn't performing strength for the crowd. He was simply stating facts in the tone of someone who had no emotional investment in whether they were believed because they were true, regardless of anyone's feelings about them. The enforcement would come whether Drevon cooperated or resisted. The reform would happen whether the pack approved or didn't. There was no negotiation point from which Drevon could leverage anything. That was what made the yard so silent. 300 wolves understanding simultaneously that the lid had just been removed. That the rules they had lived under were not laws of nature, but choices a man had made, and that a different man had now arrived with the authority to make different choices. Drevon said finally, in a voice stripped of its ceremonial weight, "What reform are you proposing?" "Court-supervised review of all pack code," Kale said. "A transitional period of 6 months under court liaison. Free movement restoration, beginning immediately. Omega rights to mate claim on equal footing with all other ranks. Compensated labor review for all conscripted work of the last 5 years." He paused. "The court will provide a written reform framework within 30 days. Your compliance is legally required under the accord." The court attendants were already moving through the crowd, distributing written documentation, the complaint findings, the reform requirements, the timeline. Efficient and prepared. This had been planned before I ever saw Kale at the border. The 3 nights had been investigation that had reached its own unexpected conclusion, and now the official proceeding had arrived to meet it. But before any of that could fully settle, something else happened. Roan Morn stepped forward. He was not a man who made desperate moves. His whole career had been built on measured action, on working within the hierarchy rather than against it. But he was Calder's father, and Calder was standing in this yard with the shame of the last 3 days written plainly on his face, and Roan Morn had spent 20 years building a future for his son. "The girl manipulated this process," Roan said loudly, loud enough for the yard to hear. "She arranged an encounter with an unknown wolf at the border specifically to trap. Roan!" Kale's voice was not raised, but it stopped Roan Morn the way a wall stops a car. "Think carefully about what you're about to say." Roan was breathing hard. I could see from where I was standing the calculation happening in real time on his face, the assessment of whether this was a fight he could win or survive, or exit intact from. But he was a man who had invested too much in a certain version of the world to let it go quietly. "She's manipulated a vulnerable situation. She was sitting on a boulder in the rain," Kale said in the same quiet tone. "Because the man your son had asked to wait for him was with another woman that same night." He looked at Roan without heat. "Your son failed to mark a woman he was with for 4 years. He accepted her loyalty, her labor, her patience, and her love, and he gave her uncertainty in return. Whatever he loses in this yard today, he has already cost himself." The silence that followed was enormous. Roan Morn sat down in it. Not literally, but everything in his posture collapsed slightly inward, the way things do when the argument they were built on has been removed. Calder hadn't moved. He was still at the edge of the yard. His face was turned partly away now, angled toward the ground, but I could see enough of it to know that Kale's words had landed with precision, and that Calder had no counter for them because they were completely accurate. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that. because I think people expect the wronged woman to feel triumph in a moment like this. What I felt was something quieter and stranger. Something like grief, briefly, for the 4 years, for the 17-year-old girl who had stood in the yard with ash seeds falling and felt lucky. For the version of Calder I had believed in before I learned he wasn't real. And then that grief passed, the way weather passes, and what was left beneath it was just open ground. Kyle, beside me, did not touch me or look at me. He was watching the yard, the documentation distribution, the gradual reorganization of 300 wolves who were beginning to understand that their world had just been permanently altered. But I could feel the bond between us, steady, undemanding, simply present, like a hand held out that required no grasping. That was when Essie found me. She was 7 now, the pack child who had drawn my portrait, the daughter of one of the kitchen women. She pushed through the crowd with the determined efficiency of a small person who has decided an adult needs to be reached, and she grabbed my hand and looked up at me with wide, serious brown eyes. "Are you leaving?" she asked. I crouched down to her level. "Yes," I said. Her face worked through several emotions quickly. "Is it because of the bad man who's gone into trouble?" She meant Drevon, I realized. 7-year-olds in this pack had apparently understood for some time who the bad men were. "Partly," I said. "Are you going somewhere better?" "I think so," I said honestly. "I think so, Essie." She considered this carefully. Then she said, "I gave you a picture." "You did?" I said. "I have it in my bag." She looked at the bag over my shoulder, nodded, satisfied. "Good," she said. "So you'll remember." She hugged me briefly, one of those total commitment child hugs that don't give you anywhere to put your hands except fully around them, and then disappeared back into the crowd. I stood up. Cale was looking at me. He had turned from the yard, just briefly, and he was looking at me with the expression I had first seen on his face the night he marked me, exposed, surprised, something younger than his usual stillness. Like the 7-year-old, and her picture had cracked something open in him too. "Ready?" he asked. I picked up my bag. The assembly yard was still full of movement, documentation, the low buzz of 300 voices beginning the work of understanding what had just happened to their world. Alpha Drevon had withdrawn to conference with the court attendants. The reform process had begun. Ironvale was already, incrementally, a different place. Bryn was standing at the kitchen entrance, watching me with her arms crossed and her chin slightly raised, the posture of a woman who is composed specifically in order to be composed. I raised my hand toward her. She raised hers back. I walked out of the assembly yard through the western gate. The path to the border marker was the same path I had walked 4 nights ago in the rain with a thermos, and it looked different now. Not because anything about the trees or the dirt road had changed, because I was walking it with my bag on my shoulder and the king of all packs beside me, and I was walking toward the border instead of away from it, and the difference between those 2 directions was the entire distance between who I had been and who I was becoming. We crossed the border marker. I stepped over the carved stone post. The Iron Veil pack bond, that wide, diffuse weather sense of 300 souls, fell away from me. Gradually, then completely, like a sound fading rather than stopping. I stood on the other side of it and waited for loss. What I felt instead was something I had not expected. Room. For the first time in 22 years, there was room around me. Not the hollow room of loneliness, which I knew very well. Something else entirely. The room of an open field after a long time in a small space. The room of a future that had not yet been described and did not yet have rules. I breathed it in. Kyle waited. "Okay," I said for the second time in 2 days, in the tone that meant something much larger than the word. "Let's go." But we didn't get far, because 50 yards past the border, in the first stand of open firs, someone was waiting for us. Chapter 10. After everything Roan Morn had left the assembly yard by the southwest gate. I know this because we worked it out afterward, when the sequence of the day was laid flat and examined. He had slipped out during the documentation distribution, in the general movement of 300 wolves processing a seismic change in their world, and he had gone around the outside of the pack boundary, not through the territory but along its edge, to the point where the western border met the first stand of open fir trees. He was not a physically dangerous man in the way of a trained fighter. He was a mid-rank beta administrator, 52 years old, a man who had spent his entire career in the machinery of hierarchy. But he was armed in the way that ranked Iron Veil wolves were routinely armed for border patrol, a tranquilizer injector, the kind used for long-distance immobilization of threats. He had one target in mind, not Kale. Roan Morn was not a fool. He knew what the consequences of harming the Alpha King would be, and he was not going to cross that threshold. He was aiming at me. I felt the bond flare before I heard anything. A sudden sharpness in it, not pain, but alert, the way a hand on your shoulder becomes a grip. Kale's head came up and he moved, and the speed of him was something I was not prepared for. The difference between the measured, still man from the boulder and this, which was like the movement of something that had been very deliberately held slow. He put himself between me and Roan's position in the tree line. The injector discharged. The dart hit Kyle in the back of the left shoulder. Roan Morn stepped out of the tree line with his arm still extended, his face a mask of calculation. And then the mask collapsed because Kyle did not go down. He reached over his own shoulder and removed the dart with the flat irritation of a man removing a splinter, and he turned to face Roan with an expression that I had not seen on him before. Not anger. Something colder than anger. The expression of a person with extensive authority confronting a very significant violation of it. Roan's arm dropped. "Roan Morn," Kale said. His voice was entirely even. "You have just committed an assault against the Alpha King's marked mate in the presence of the king. You have also discharged a weapon within the boundary of an active Accord enforcement action." He looked at Roan with the kind of calm that is worse than fury. "Set the weapon down." Roan set it down. His hands, I noticed, were shaking. Two of the court attendants emerged from behind us. They had followed, I realized, at a discreet distance, because this was their job, to ensure that the king's movements in volatile territory were not unescorted. They reached Rowan in seconds. Rowan was not looking at Kyle. He was looking at me. And the look on his face, underneath the fear, underneath the collapsed calculation, was something I had not expected. He was looking at me the way people look at things they have grievously underestimated, with a terrible, belated understanding. "She was never good enough for him," he said. It came out not as an argument, but as something smaller, the last reflex of a world view that had just been entirely dismantled. She was Omega. She was nobody. I stood in the open fir forest with my bag on my shoulder, and I looked at Roan Morn. I thought about 14 years of breakfast service. The particular weariness of feeding people who did not see you while you fed them. I thought about my father, carrying supplies to the wrong checkpoint at the wrong time, dying in a skirmish that the pack had mourned for 3 days, and then moved past. I thought about Omega Row, and the small cabin, and the dried herbs on the ceiling beam, and the particular loneliness of being useful in a place that equates usefulness with worth. "I know," I said to Rowan, quietly. "I know that's what you believe." I looked at him steadily. I spent 22 years in a pack that believed the same thing, and I understand now that the problem was never that I wasn't enough. The problem was that you built a world too small to see what you had. He said nothing. I turned away from him. The court attendants handled the rest. Roan Morn was detained for assault and transported to the court holding facility that afternoon, where the formal proceedings would begin within the week. His actions added a criminal charge to the Accord violations already pending against Iron Veil's leadership structure, which accelerated the reform timeline considerably. Calder, I learned this later from Bryn, who sent a letter 6 weeks after, accepted a formal demotion from Beta Succession. He left Iron Veil voluntarily 2 months later. Bryn's letter said he had gone north, to a smaller pack, and she did not know what he was looking for. I read that part of the letter twice, and then I folded it and put it away, because there was nothing in me left to give the subject of Calder Morn. Not grief, not anger, Not even the particular sadness of things that could have been different. Just the clear, clean absence of a weight I had been carrying for 4 years. The court liaison named Iron Vale's reform coordinator 2 weeks after the assembly. It was a mid-rank female wolf from a neighboring pack with a record for fair governance and a calm temperament. Bryn's letter said she had abolished the Omega movement restrictions on her first day, that the morning kitchen had been reorganized on voluntary schedules, that Essie's mother had been given back wages for 4 years of conscripted service. I was glad. The Ashfall territory was 400 miles north, as Cale had said. We traveled over 3 days, Cale and I and the court attendants, through a landscape that changed gradually from the pine-heavy Cascades into something higher and more open, wide ridges and granite outcrops, and a sky that felt genuinely enormous in a way that valley skies never quite managed. The court's headquarters was built into a north-facing ridge above a river valley, a long stone building with high windows, and a courtyard full of the small, specific noise of people doing consequential work. It was not what I had imagined a king's court to look like. There was no formality in the physical space, no thrones, no ceremonial gates. Just rooms full of people reading documents and having arguments and making decisions that affected the lives of hundreds of thousands of wolves across the continent. I stood in the courtyard on the first morning, and I looked at it all. And I felt, again, that quality of room that I had felt stepping over the Iron Vale border marker. Cale was beside me. He had been beside me, consistently and without announcement, for the entire 3 days of travel, present in the particular way he was always present, attentive without demand, close without pressure. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think I'm going to need a week before I understand what I'm looking at," I said. "Fair," he said. "And I think I want to contribute to this," I said. "Not as a kitchen worker. I mean, I'll cook if you need me to." "We have cooks," he said. "Good, but I mean, I know things about how packs feel from the inside of an Omega rank that your court doesn't know from the outside of it. I spent 22 years learning how hierarchy works from the bottom. That's information. It should be used." He was looking at me with that expression, the complete, quiet attention, the near smile. "Yes," he said. "It should." "I want to work," I told him, "properly. Not as a mate who decorates the court, as someone who does actual useful things. That was never in question," he said. And I heard in his voice what I'd heard from the beginning, the absolute certainty, the correction of a fact stated wrongly. It had never been in question. Not to him. I had to sit with that for a moment. The extraordinary novelty of being in the company of someone for whom my capability was not a surprise. "There is one other thing," he said, a little carefully. I looked at him. "What?" "The marking," he said. "On the continent, when the king marks a mate, there was a formal ceremony. For the court and the allied packs. It happens at the first full moon after the private marking." He paused. "It's in 3 weeks. I thought about the Iron Vale full moon ceremony that Calder had offered me. The crowd, the formality, how I had looked at the image of it and felt only the weight of a cage with a ceremony attached. I looked at Cale. I thought about 3 nights at a border marker, a boulder in the rain. Not because you're not worth it. The way he sat, like the rain was completely irrelevant. The way he had looked at me when Essie hugged me in the assembly yard. The full, surprised smile that arrived slowly and changed his whole face. "Will there be a feast?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Am I cooking?" He laughed, a real one, full and easy, the laugh of a man who had perhaps been too careful with his laughter for too long. It transformed his face completely. "No," he said. "You are not cooking." "Okay," I said. "Then I'll be there." We stood in the courtyard in the morning light, with the river sound below, and the court workers moving around us, and the whole enormous continental governance operation humming in its regular rhythms. And the bond between us, that specific, targeted, utterly clear thread that had hummed in my bones since the night on the border, settled into something deeper than a hum. Something that felt less like a new sound and more like a frequency that had always been present and had simply, finally, been turned on. I had walked out of Ironvale with one bag. I had not walked out with nothing. I had walked out with the certainty that I had never been what they told me I was. I had walked out with the knowledge that the cage had been made of other people's fear, and that I had never needed their permission to be more than what they had room for. I had walked out with a man who had sat beside me in the rain, uninvited, and had never once required me to be smaller. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. If this story moved you, if Zara's walk out of that assembly yard made you want to stand up, drop a comment below. Tell me which chapter cracked your heart open. Tell me where you're listening from, what time it is, whether it's raining. And if you want to know what happens at the full moon ceremony in Ashfall, whether the continent's packs accept their king's Omega mate, whether old enemies come calling, whether Zara Ashvale finds out just how powerful she has always been, let me know. The sequel is waiting. Like this video. Share it with someone who deserves a story about a woman who finally chose herself. The end.